Today we're going to be looking at particle systems inside of 3ds Max and space warps that we can use to manipulate the way that those particle systems react. So first we're going to go to the Create tab because we want to create an object, our geometry, and I already have it shown here, but we'll go to our drop down and choose particle systems. There's more than one way to get to any of these sections in 3ds Max, so if you know a different way, it's okay to use that. If not, then please feel free to go just like I did. First, we'll choose snow, and we're going to click and drag at an area for our snow. Understand that unlike our forces or our space warps, the size of our emitter does make a difference. The bigger the emitter, the larger area that our particles will emit from. So now that I've created my snow particle system, I'm going to go from my Create tab to my Manipulate tab so that I can manipulate the settings. And one thing that we'll see is that we don't have a whole lot of parameters here. And one thing that we can see if we scrub our timeline is we see some snow. It's nice and pretty. But it starts at frame 0, and we don't necessarily want that. If we have a scene where we want it to already be snowing, then we need to change when our emitter starts. That can be done under timing. So we have start, which we say is starting at frame 0. So let's change that to something before frame 0 so that our particles are already emitting. Let's maybe say like -100. So now we have 100 frames where it's already emitting. Another thing that we can change is the life of the particle. Depending on speed and life can work together. So for example, if I play my particle system, maybe that snow is too fast for me. Maybe I want it to be a lot slower. So then I would take my speed and change that to something lower. So let's say I want it to be 1. The issue now is that the particle dies because of its lifespan before it reaches the bottom of what I'm using for my ground plane or my grid here. So what I would have to do is change my life to be a larger number. Let's say like 200. Now we can definitely see that might even be a little bit too much. And that might not be enough. So we can definitely come in and play around with those numbers until we get what we want. But for right there, we'll say that's good for right there. So let's take a look at some of these settings. Our viewport count. This is the number of particles that we'll see at any given time in our viewport. And this area that we're looking at is our viewport. If I want to have more particles, then I can change that to a higher number. And I'll see more particles. Or if I want to see less, like maybe a 10% representation or whatever. My render count is how many I will see in my render. So here I have 10 particles, but if I render, I'll see that I have much more than 10 particles here. And it might be hard to see, so let me zoom in. So I've got more than 10 particles here. So you can play around with those numbers and have whatever you want. Maybe I want 200 in the viewport and maybe 500 in my renderer. So then if I render, you can see that I've got quite a bit more there. The flake size is the size of our particles. If we want them to be bigger or smaller or whatever it is, we can definitely change those. We change that to 1. Speed, like we talked about before, is how fast we're going to fall. And our variation is variation from our emitter. So are we all just going to fall outwards? Are we falling all over? We're being emitted from a variety of different places. If I change that to 0, you can see I'm only being emitted from my emitter. Tumble is rotation, basically. So you can see as I change that number, my particles are tumbling or rotating, and then the tumble rate. So the higher that number is, the faster they're going to spin. And we'll just take those back to default. That's fine. Right under that for renderer, or I'm sorry, tumble rate, we have flakes, dots, and ticks. Flakes, dots, and ticks is just what it looks like in the renderer. So flakes, I look like a flake. Dots, I look like a dot. Ticks, I look like a little plus sign, little tick. But if we render it, we'll see that our renderer, the shape that our renderer has, doesn't change. We still look like a 6-pointed star. And that is because our renderer says we're 6-point. If I want to do triangle, I can do triangle. And if I want to do facing, then I have facing. And these are actually planes, but they're called facing because they're always facing the viewport. This is also in the video game industry known as billboarding. So we'll change that back to 6. We've gone over timing, when we want our emitter to start emitting in the life of our particles. Then we have constant. Constant means we are constantly, as soon as one particle dies, we have another one that's taking its place. Whereas if we turn constant off, what that means is that for the life, we're going, and we'll have to change this to a shorter life to actually see what's going on. For the life, we're going to emit our particles, and then after that life is over, it will emit another batch. Birth rate. So birth rate by 0 means that we don't have any of them being born. Our birth rate is 0. So life, maybe we'll change this to something like 20, and then birth rate, what do we want our birth rate to be? So if we have 20, then that's what we're doing for our emissions. So maybe we do a life of birth rate 1. We have fewer, 500 more. But what we can see is that because our render count is 500 and our viewport count is 200, and we're trying to render, or we're trying to birth 500, that's our max. So it's birthing all of them. And then as soon as they die, because our lifespan is only 20 frames, it will birth another set. Now in snow, this doesn't really look all that great, but if we had like an explosion, then we would definitely want to use, instead of constant, we would want to use birth rate because we don't want to constantly be emitting that explosion. Okay, now that we've looked at snow, let's look at another type of particle system inside of particle systems. And again, I went to Create tab, Geometry. I drop down to Particle Systems. This time I'm going to choose Blizzard. And again, the size of my box determines the size of my emitter, or where my particles are going to emit from. And if we go into our Modify tab, because we've already created it, now we want to change it, so we'll go to the Modify tab. We'll see that we have a whole lot more areas that we can change parameters than we did with snow. I'm going to open up some of these so that we can see what's going on. We can do a lot of the same things here that we could do in snow. Difference is that we have more options. So again, from 0, I start snowing at frame 0, or showing my particles. So let's change some of this. My speed, maybe I want to be 1 with a variation percentage. So if I said 50% variation, then I would actually I would have a speed of 0.5 to 1.5 because I have that variation. So that's really good for random lookingness. Tumble, again, is our rotation, and tumble rate is how much we're rotating. And let's see, my use rate, maybe 100. Particle size, let's make that bigger. My emit start, let's make that into something before 0 because I want it emitting before I'm scrubbing my timeline. My emit stop, for what I'm going to show, let's go ahead and make it our entire timeline, so something longer than 100, maybe say that's 150. Display until, what this does, if I have, say, on 30, then after frame 30, I'm not going to display any of my particles. So since I want all my particles on screen at all the time, I'm just going to display until, and I want it to be after 100. So after 100. So maybe 150. And then the life of the particle, as I can see with a speed of 1, it's not quite reaching the ground. So I'm going to want my life to be longer. So maybe 60. What happens if we do 60? Not 6, 60. Is that good enough? That's just, maybe we'll do 70. Give it a few more frames. Now we can see we're under that ground plane. So that looks good. Now going back up to the top, with our viewport display, again we see dots and ticks, but we have another option for mesh. So when I select mesh, I can come down to particle type, and I have particle types, standard particles, which is what I'm doing for my mesh. And then my standard particles by default, I believe, is triangles, but we're going to choose sphere. So whatever the default is, we're choosing sphere. And we can see now we have a lot of spheres. And we can see the size. Our particle size is 2. If that's too big or too small, we can change that. So maybe let's keep that 2, but the variation I want to be like 75%. So now we have some that are 75% bigger, 75% smaller. And then grow for and fade for. What this does is that if we can see at the top, our particles are small because the time that they're born and 10 frames after, they're growing from nothing to whatever their final sizes be. I can make that higher, so maybe I want to do like 30 frames, and we can see that they're a lot smaller, and they're growing over 30 frames into their final size. And then fade for is the same thing, but instead of growing into, we're growing out of. So we have our size, our final size, and then we fade back into 0. So let's say that's over 30 frames. Now I've got a lot of smaller down here. And we'll see when we scrub it, we have small particles that grow into big particles that go back into small particles. If we don't want it to do that, we can say fade for 0, and we'll just stay big. Or we can say grow for 0, and we'll just start big. It makes more sense for snow or blizzard or whatever it is that we're doing. If I wanted to do something, a mesh, but I wanted it to be something different than a sphere, then I could come into my particle types, and for what we're wanting, if we have our own custom mesh that we want to use, we can use instanced geometry. So what I'm going to do is just quickly import, or merge rather, merge, what will, let's see if we can do it with this, the BMW. Okay, so what I can say is, select my particle system, and I'm on mesh. I'm going to choose instance geometry under particle type, and then I have a drop down, or rather a button that I can choose under instancing parameters called pick object. So I'm going to click my BMW, and we'll give it a minute. It's thinking. We might need to change the size. But what we can see is that now all of our snow is BMWs. We're snow in BMWs. So let's see if we can change our size. Okay, so we'll try to change our size. I apologize, it's pretty laggy. Maybe a 0.25. Still too much. So 0.25. Okay, that looks a little better. So now you see we're snowing little BMWs. That's pretty funny, I think. Okay, so let's try to get some of this frame rate back. So I'm going to change this back from instanced to standard, change that back to a sphere. I'll need to change the size again. We had 2 before. So now our frame rate's a lot better. We're snowing on our car. So that's a neat little thing that we can do if you have a mesh that you want to use for your particle system. Okay, another thing that we can do is, as we can see with our snow, it's white, which most snow is. Now, if I render it, I'll see my snow. And maybe I want it to be a different color, or maybe I have some kind of really neat shader I want to use. So I'm going to bring up my material editor, and I'm just going to quickly create a material. So maybe my diffuse, and let me bring this over here so we can see. I'm going to choose like a blue. Maybe going to give it some specularity and some glossiness. But what I can do is I can apply this color to my particle system. So I'm going to choose my particle system. I'm going to assign it and show it. And there are other ways, but for just the sake of ease, I'll show this one. If you know another way, that's perfectly fine. And if we render, we can see that now our snow is the color of the material that we used. It's really cool if you want to use methyl ray materials, or if you have some kind of really neat procedurally generated material that you want to use. That's awesome. So one thing that we haven't looked at is forces, or ways that we can manipulate our particle emitter. So to create a force, we're going to go to our Create tab once again, and we're going to instead go to our Space Warps, click on that, and by default our first tab is Forces. And I'm going to show Wind. You can really choose whichever one you want, but I'm just going to show Wind. And wind can be determined, or is the way the wind is pointing, that's the way that it's going to manipulate your particles. So I do have some parameters for wind, like strength, decay, if I want it to be a planar wind, or just be in the direction, or if I want it to be spherical, and spherical means it's going to go out in every direction. Then I have turbulence, frequency, scale, and I'll let you play around with all of those however you see fit. But what we'll notice now, if we scrub our timeline, absolutely nothing different. Everything is exactly the same. And the reason why is because this is a space warp, and our particle emitter doesn't know anything about our space warp, and our space warp doesn't know anything about our particle emitter by default. So we kind of have to introduce them to each other, or bind them together. To do that, we go up to our Bind Space Warps, which is in the upper left-hand corner of our screen. We hover over, it says Bind to Space Warp. Looks kind of like 3 lines with a chain, or I like to call it wavy bacon. So I'm going to click on it, and it turns blue, and that tells me that it's active. So then I'll go to my emitter. I'm going to click and hold, and then drag. And I'll know it's working if I see that dotted line. And I'm going to click, hold, drag to my force, and I'll know I'm over the force and that it will accept it when it turns yellow and I've got the wavy bacon in the plate, or whatever you want to call it. Now if I let go, now we can see that my wind is manipulating my snow. And I can always come in and change that. Let's find our wind, it kind of disappeared. I'm just opening up my Scene Explorer. Wind, let's bring it to 0, 0. I'm not sure where it is. Now it's there. Okay. Okay, that's just fine. I can change the strength. So if I want it to be less strength, maybe even less than that. And I can see it's manipulating my particles less and less. The same thing as if I brought in gravity. I'm going to bring in gravity. I'm going to bind my particle system to my gravity. And now we can see that gravity is also affecting. So the wind was so low and the gravity is a lot higher that the gravity is really pulling it down more than the wind is pushing it. Well, I can change that to be less, and now I have the wind and the gravity both acting on it. So we can use all kinds of forces, and there's a lot of different forces that we can use, and I would say go ahead and play around with these. It's not going to blow up your computer. Okay, so let's try one more. And let's keep our car. We got plans for the car. Okay. So the next particle system that we're going to look at, and the last one for this video, is we're going to choose super spray. Now super spray has a lot of really cool things that we can do. For the sake of the video, since we've gone over a lot of the parameters for blizzard and snow, I'm going to use a preset so we can kind of save time, and we'll see how we can use one other thing that we haven't looked at yet that will help manipulate our particles. So I'm going to go into my Modify tab, and we have a lot of the same things that we had in our blizzard. I'm going to choose Load Save Preset and just choose Fire Hose. Bubbles is fun to play with too. I'm going to choose Fire Hose. And again, since I by default start at 0, I'm going to change my emit time. Start at -250. Kind of been doing that a lot today. Emitter stop 250, display until, that's fine, life is fine, variation, that's fine. Particle size, will bump this up pretty good. Let's say maybe 10. And I'm going to use mesh. And instead of triangles, I'm going to come in and use spheres. So now I kind of have a blobby, fluidy look. See, variation, let's do like a 50% variation. So we got, well, maybe 75. Now we've got small blobs and big blobs. We'll grow 4. We're going to try to look like we're coming out of a hose. So we want the beginning to be smaller. So grow 4, maybe we'll do 50 frames. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Okay. Now I'm going to want, what I'm going to try to do is make it look like I have water falling on the car and dripping off the car. Well, to do that, I'm going to need some gravity. I need this to come downward. So I'm going to again go to my space warps, and I have forces and gravity. And again, because I want my particle system to be affected by my space warp, I have to bind to space warp, click and drag to gravity. Now, if this is too much, we can remember we can always turn our gravity down. So gravity strength maybe 25.25. Okay, we'll go with that. Whatever it is, we're going to go with it. Okay, so maybe I've come here. So what I see is I have my water falling on my car. And again, I can use my material. So maybe I want to have a little transparency. I'm going to turn my opacity down. Okay. And I want this to look like it's falling, hitting the car, and rolling off. In order to do that, or to put it a better way, I'm going to fake collision. I have to use what's called a deflector, because I want to deflect the particle system away from what it looks like it's hitting. To do that, I'm going to go back to my Create tab, and it's back in my space warps, but instead of forces, I'm going to choose deflectors. And each one of these deflectors has a different shape, a different purpose, but we're just going to use a basic deflector, which again we're going to pull and drag out. And then I'm going to move so that it corresponds pretty much with the top of my car. And this is going to be kind of smoke and mirrors. In order for this to work, I again have to bind my particle system to my deflector. So what I'll do again is bind to space warp, click and drag to my deflector, and what we see is that now my water looks like it's bouncing off the car. If I move this deflector, the particles will move with it. Now my deflector does have some properties that I can change, so I'm going to go into my Modify tab, and I don't want it to bounce quite so much. So maybe we'll do like 0.4. Now we can see that it's not quite so bouncy. But now we're hitting our hood. So maybe I can either create another deflector or I'll just copy this one. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and since I have my translate on, I'm going to translate on the Y-axis while holding Shift, and it will copy it for me. And click OK. I can bring this down, kind of line it up with my hood a little bit. So I'll rotate it a little bit so it's a little bit in line with that hood. And again, let's bind. Let's bind that particle system to the deflector. And now we've got what looks like bouncing water. So maybe on this one we want it to look like it's doing a couple of other things. So let's say our bounce is fine, but our variation, we want it to be like 75%. So our bounce could be more, it could be less. Chaos, a little chaos. Let's do 100% chaos. Friction, maybe we'll give it a little bit of friction. Water does have surface tension, and so we do have a little bit of friction. Maybe 10%. That sounds good. That looks good. So now with our chaos and our variation, we have some of those that are going off to the side, bouncing up a little bit, and we look like we have true splash there. So that's pretty much all that we're going to go over as far as basic particles go. What I would do is invite you to play around with all of these settings, create different particles, use different space warps, use different forces. Vortex is a lot of fun. Just play around and see what you can create. Until next time.